Burger King, a fast food chain that is now recognized all over the world, has a story that goes back a long way. It all started with two men, James McLamore and David Edgerton, who would change the face of the fast food industry forever. Before we dive into the full gist, take a minute to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell. James McLamore was born on May 30, 1926, in New York City, New York. His father was Thomas McLamore, a former lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and his mother was Marion Floyd Whitman, a homemaker. David Edgerton was born a year later, on May 26, in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, to Blanche Berger, a violinist who performed across the nation, and David Edgerton Sr., a hotel manager and steel mill worker. James grew up on the Whitman family farm in Edgehill, where his grandmother took care of him and his two siblings while his father traveled to and from New York City by train to work at a bank. However, after the stock market crashed in 1929, the Depression took its toll on the family. James's mother was moved to a sanitarium where she spent the rest of her days. James never saw her again. James' father also lost his job in New York, and with Marion gone, he moved the family out to the farm. 4 years after the stock market crash, a fire ravaged Edgehill and ended it as a working farm. James's grandmother had to sell half of the 200-acre property and many of her most valuable possessions to make ends meet. She sent James's older sister, Claire, to Northfield Seminary in Massachusetts first and then planned to send James to the sister school, Mount Kermit School for Boys. However, 2 years later, she died of a severe heart attack before she could see James attend boarding school. Despite the tragedy, her wish for James to attend boarding school was fulfilled. The next year, he set out for Mount Hermon, where he missed his family and had difficulty adjusting to the new life at first. However, he eventually thrived there and was even elected class president in his senior year. James took an interest in Cornell University because of its affordable tuition and applied to its hotel administration school, which was the only business program at the time. However, he had no plan, no job, nowhere to stay, and only $10 to his name. Meanwhile, David joined the Army while James chose the Navy, dropping out of Cornell 2 years after he was accepted. While he waited to be called to service, James decided to take a job and get some experience in the hotel field. He wound up working at the Astor bar, sitting behind bartenders and bringing up tabs as they served drinks. James's naval service brought him back to Cornell as part of the Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps before he graduated 3 years after enlisting and went in search of work. Newly married, he looked far and wide to support his family and eventually landed an interview to be the director of food service at the YMCA in Wilmington, Delaware, for the largest cafeteria in the state. He got the job and headed out with his wife Nancy Nickel. David had also attended Cornell, where he studied hotel and restaurant management but dropped out. He later attended Northwestern University, dropping out but staying in the area and starting a successful pie bakery that served Northwestern students. While working at the YMCA, James noticed that a local restaurant named Toddle House had been busy 24 hours a day. It was a quick-service restaurant with only 10 seats, and James believed that if he had opened a similar business, it would be a success. James brought his idea to life, naming it the Colonial Inn and renting an empty bike repair shop next door to the Toddle House for $300 a month. He believed that by making his restaurant fancier than its inspiration, he could outcompete them. The Colonial Inn began its operation by opening its doors to customers at the start of the new year. It quickly became a local favorite and made $90,000 in its first year alone, of which James took $15,000 home. With the Colonial Inn successful, James took a trip to Miami to visit his father-in-law. While there, his father-in-law showed him a vacant building and suggested he open another restaurant. Unfortunately for him, James soon learned that Miami was a seasonal city and the crowds he saw clamoring for food were all gone when his new restaurant opened 6 months later. Little did James know he would soon cross paths with fellow Cornell dropout David and be forced to make a tough call: save the business or walk away. While James struggled to keep the new restaurant afloat, David traveled to Jacksonville, Florida to meet with Matthew Burns and Keith Kramer, the founders of a new restaurant chain named Untold Burger King, named after the instant machines they used to prepare food. James had already thought of opening up a multi-unit chain restaurant, something he believes the new restaurant could never be. However, he needed more capital to join David in the venture. If he wanted in, he only had one choice. He would have to sell his restaurant a year later. A year later, James and David managed to open 3 Untold Burger King locations, but each one was failing. Fortunately, James's father-in-law began to host events at his home with the sole intent of introducing James to potential investors. During one cocktail party at his father-in-law's home, James was introduced to Harvey Fruhoff of the Detroit-based Fruhoff Trailer Company. During their conversation, James convinced Harvey to invest $65,000 into their company for a 50% stake. David and James used this money to open 3 new locations, only one of which showed any promise, but they weren't the only ones struggling. Even the original Jacksonville chain was doing poorly. One day, David and James decided to visit one of their new locations on the way from Jacksonville to Miami, and were shocked to find it empty. James went for a walk and was drawn in by a line of customers waiting outside a dirty, rundown drive-in restaurant. Curious, James got in line and picked up a pair of burgers for himself and David. What they found was a big tasty burger with a quarter-pound patty on a 5H bond with the works: lettuce, tomatoes, onions, pickles, mayonnaise, and ketchup. After eating, James and David decided that was exactly what the restaurants needed. They came up with plans for a large burger with all the fixings for their restaurant. They decided to call it the Whopper to make people think of something big when they got back to Miami. James and David made the Whopper the mainstay of their instant Burger King locations. They standardized the burger for all 7 of the restaurants, sold it for 37 cents, and added advertising proclaiming them the home of the Whopper. It was immediately a huge success and would soon be adopted by other franchises. David and James chose to replace the InstaShake with a more reliable milkshake maker. With this, they removed the Insta from their branding and became Burger King, home of the Whopper. James and David had begun unofficially leading the company. Even the founders in Jacksonville are following their lead. In recognition of their success, the founders gave the 2 exclusive franchising rights to Southern Florida, unaware of how much trouble Jacksonville was really in. Soon Keith and Matthew defaulted on their loans before the end of the year and were out. Their creditor, Ben Stein, was in control. The only problem was Ben had no idea how to run a restaurant, let alone a chain. He wanted Miami to take control of him, but they could never find an agreement that worked. It took 4 years before Ben traveled out to Miami for a fateful lunch where James offered him 15% of whatever they brought in each month for control of the company. Today, Burger King is one of the world's largest chains with thousands of locations in over 100 countries. As for the Whopper, it remains its most iconic menu item, helping to bring in over $1 billion in revenue, and it's listed as one of America's favorite burgers. This is the story of Burger King and how it became a global billion-dollar powerhouse. We hope you got inspired by this story too. Learn not to give up on your dreams like the Burger King known founders. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell.